Right, welcome everybody. We're going to try with the microphones to start with, and see if we get feedback. It is quite cosy, so other than for the recording, if we don't need them, we will avoid them. But we'll try now, sounding like Davros. So yes, welcome. We've got quite a lot to go through today, so I will quickly run through the timings before we start to get into the agenda. Please feel free to correct me if you need more time, Steve. Since you're the one that's done all the work. We'll get through the minutes, declarations of interest in a couple of minutes. I don't believe we've got any public questions. Progress on outcomes and recommendations is just for noting, and if anybody's got anything they want to bring up. Progress on school attainment. It's 15 minutes, not enough. Do you need more than 15 minutes for doing school attainment?
Might do.
Yeah, that's fine. No. You should check. Elective home education. 15, 20? 15,
20 minutes.
20, yeah, okay, you've ruined it, you can get out, you're not welcome. Yeah, 20 for both, yeah. School exclusions, bear in mind my exclusions. Yeah.
I'm going to go for 20 again.
Yeah, no, that's fine, as long as we know where we are. And then the committee's work plan, 10 minutes, and members' question time, 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how well. Does that suit everybody? Is that okay? Excellent. So, minutes of the previous meeting. Everyone happy for me to sign those? Any declarations of interest? Steve?
I'm governor at Holy Cross Catholic Primary School and Quintet Foundation Primary School.
We need to get on recording, don't we, Steve? Anybody else? No, I will declare that I was once part of the home ed network with my youngest daughter, but no longer. Just in case that's relevant. Okay. Any comment on progress and outcomes from previous minutes? Because I know we do go through a lot and we do get a lot covered, and our colleagues from over the water seem to do a hell of a lot for us. But is there anything anybody wants to point out? No, that's good. You're getting enough light today, you are. That's fantastic. So straight into school attainment. Whoever that was.
I think I'm going to start that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're doing a double act really. So Natalie Smith, County Education Manager, Secondary and Post 16.
Eric Holton, County Education Manager for Primary and Early Years, which is why we're a double act, given the cross-phase nature of the paper.
Don't forget your microphones just in case.
Okay. Is everyone, normally people can hear me quite well.
It's for the recording.
Okay, can everyone hear that now? Yeah. Okay, so we haven't had the way that schools normally publish their data so that everyone can see them for the last 2 years. So we thought it would be helpful to go back to 2019, which was the last time that schools did have their data published into performance tables, and just set the scene with a reminder of where Isle of Wight schools were then. So early years in 2019 were in line with national. All of these different measures are slightly different, so I'm just going to compare each of them with national. Key stage 2, age-related expectation, so that's at the end of primary school, they had improved significantly, but were not yet in line with national, so that was still a real focus of our work and has continued to be through the pandemic. Key stage 4, which is the end of year 11, again had shown significant improvement over a number of years in all measures, and the measures that are used at key stage 4 are the basics, which is English and maths at level 4, which is the bottom of the old C, or English and maths at level 5, grade 5, which is the top of the old C. Both those measures had improved, as had the Attainment 8 measure, and the Attainment 8 measure is a measure of attainment across 8 qualifications that include English, maths and science. And so that measure had improved also, but in those measures, as secondary schools themselves were acutely aware, they were not yet in line with national, and we've worked very closely with secondary schools through the pandemic to help them continue those improvement trajectories. In terms of Ofsted, Ofsted stopped through most of the pandemic, carrying out its usual inspections. What it did though was it inspected, monitored schools that required improvement twice previously. So there were a number of those inspections across the island, and all of those inspections were really very positive, and the inspections were written up so they can be found on the Ofsted website. and they all showed that for every school that was seen, they were doing a really good job for children during COVID and for communities during COVID, and they were focusing on outcomes for children as well as supporting them with their mental health. Ofsted inspections have now resumed. That has caused controversy because for some schools they were being inspected with so many staff not there, so many children not there. Nevertheless, of the schools that have been inspected by Ofsted since that point, they have all shown significant improvements, which has ended up with the current figure being 77% good or better. Thankfully, there are no longer any schools judged to be inadequate on the Isle of Wight. And although attendance figures haven't been formally published yet because they lag behind real data, we've been collecting attendance figures from the CFB feed. And what has been particularly pleasing during the pandemic is that the attendance figures across the Isle of Wight on average have been higher than national figures. And that's for the first time in a very, very long time. And I think really shows the efforts that have gone into supporting those children and families and getting those children into schools. So that's something that the Isle of Wight teachers and leaders have worked incredibly hard on, supported by all of us. And you know, there's no better place really for children than to be in school, so that's very positive. In terms of progression, it's the whole point of all of this stuff that we do with children is to make sure that the next steps that they go on to are fulfilling and are going to lead to them having positive life outcomes. And actually the data on the Isle of Wight has been good for a very long time. In 2021, the percent of 16 and 17-year-olds that went into educational training was much higher than that nationally, and formal participation rates are also strong, stronger than national thereafter. And as is usually the case, the proportion of children that are not in education or training is lower on the Isle of Wight than nationally. So that's really strong, and hopefully that will continue to be the case. We're now moving on to what's happened over the last 2 years, and we'll start here with returning to early years, and Eric.
So the picture that we have of attainment over that record that Natalie's been talking about has always been informed by statutory assessment, which are collected, standardised, and give us an opportunity to compare cohorts, schools, previous generations and so on. For the last 2 years, children have continued to learn things. Teachers have continued to teach them. So it would be wrong to assert that just because there haven't been statutory assessments, there's been no attainment. In fact, the feedback that we get from receiving schools who are taking children in is whilst they recognise cohorts have slightly different needs, that actually we haven't seen a kind of disaster at the start of secondary school, disaster at the start of year one. So the profession has done good work in continuing to maintain the focus on the essentials. The reality is, though, that education is more than just the essentials of maths. It is all of maths. It's more than just the essentials of writing. It's all of theirs. In fact, the national curriculum that was reorganised in 2015 and the early years curriculum, which has been through a revision more recently, is predicated on the idea that what should be giving all children is a complete curriculum, not a partial one, not one where teachers can decide some bits to teach and other schools can teach other bits to teach, that there should be a universality of the content. And the second concept that's built into the way that the curriculum is organised is that the curriculum is intended to build. So if you miss a building block from 1 year, you can't just carry on with the next year programme. So the challenge for schools has been to look backwards, to look for gaps, and to make sure that they're moving forward on firm ground, rather than rushing across in order to keep pace with an arbitrary figure that would have stood true for previous generations of children. So in early years, it's a developmental stage that children need to reach, and you can't rush children's development. So when they haven't had physical contact with each other, when they haven't had social skill development, when they haven't had the practical physical skill development, you can't just have a catch-up group in the afternoon. They need to experience those things. In Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, in other words, during primary years, from age 5 to age 11, the curriculum is something that's taught. Teachers are important, and it's a very careful planning process. When children don't experience the right curriculum, they can't learn it, which means they can't progress on to the next parts of the curriculum. So the issue is that, so if we compared a generation of children with a previous generation of them, we'd say there would have to be a slowing of progress, because progress is slowed by the fact that they haven't been taught the curriculum. So, but how that has impacted has varied enormously, right down to an individual child level. So if you've been in school all the time, in fact, you have the bonus of being in school in very small teaching groups, when everybody else learned because you were a key worker, and this is true of some children, key worker children, and some of them with some vulnerabilities in terms of early special needs, have made dramatic progress. In fact, they've relished the attention of very small classes. Other children have been at home, and actually the key indicator seems to be the amount of attention they had at home. So this is doing some interesting things with the cohort we would call vulnerable. Because some children who wouldn't be regarded as vulnerable, their parents were hard-pressed, working full-time, and could do very little with them to support. And the children were smiling at their teachers online. And the teachers think, well, probably that's going in, but we know from teaching and learning that's not how you find it's going in. And if you had experience of home learning, you will have recognised that. The issue really that schools are facing is they can't just carry on with a kind of whole class approach, because they need to get under the bonnet of what the individual needs are, and these aren't special needs, these are just areas of curriculum that are missing. And I'm hearing anecdotally teachers saying, well, I was about to teach, what was the last one I heard? We were about to teach about shapes, and I used the word radius, and they all went, what's a radius? I went, well, it's year 6, you should know what radius is, but they obviously clearly weren't, that bit of curriculum was missing for that class, that cohort at that time. So it's not, however, been a negative experience for children, and partly some children's experience has been different, and partly, actually, some things that parents found quite accessible to teach were taught really well, and with quite a lot of individual attention, that probably was more than they got in the classroom. So some handwriting has gone, has become much better, because it's an easy thing to practice and something parents could get their If we had to just summarise, though, from primary early years, and it's never, if you stood right back and said, despite all that I've said about being very individualised, generally speaking, more vulnerable children have been more affected by these things. It would be, I wouldn't want to stereotype that to every individual, but of course, it is the children who were doubly disadvantaged by the lack of the educational culture in their home, or the impact of poverty on their household, and the lack of attention their parents could give them when they wanted to, plus the fact that they were starting further behind anyway, is a double disadvantage. So we're having to work really hard at making sure that cohort, not universally, but those in that cohort that were particularly affected, that have been also had their needs addressed.
I think the picture that Eric speaks of in primary school is the same in secondary school, with the most notable thing being that there really are no patterns. So secondary school teachers are finding that all of their assumptions from previously have been turned on their heads, and they really need to look at each child individually. Examples of that include people saying to me, counsellors saying to me, teachers saying to me, oh, it's year 8, they've really suffered across the system, but then in another school it will be year 9, another school year 10, talking about different groups of children. Oh, our boys have come back absolutely all over the place. In other cases it's, oh, our girls have been running riot. So it really has widened the landscape, which people are finding. So bearing all of this in mind, and bearing in mind the fact that there have been some children that have actually thrived on online learning, and instead of painting their nails under the duvet or doing whatever terrible things my children were doing because they had no supervision at all, they were actually relishing that opportunity to have access to all of those resources. The ways that children have been graded since have been quite interesting in terms of what the outcomes look like. So this wasn't particularly obvious in 2020, which is the first year of lockdown, where secondary schools were required to look at the work that children had done previously before lockdown started and create a centre assessed grade from the work that they had done. The centre assessed grades that had been done, the centre assessed grades that were calculated bore no relation to anything that happened over lockdown, because as we know, children were just sent home. They were there only for the children to help them to get into the next stage of their educational training, which they did, but they weren't collected or put into performance tables. But we did ask people about them, and we did ask what they looked like, and what inevitably was the case, as was reported nationally, was that there had been kind of an uptick. The grades that people had given children meant that the overall grades improved. There was an outcry, I think some of you might remember, that was because teacher assessment was too generous, and I would contest that, because actually when you get children sitting GCSE papers, a lot of them don't do as well as you'd have hoped. A lot of them get very nervous. There's all the incidences that happen around GCSE time. You know, it could be a pet dying, it could be something happening to a family member. They all influence outcomes. So what they were looking at with the central assessed grades was the potential of the children without any of that kind of noise that happens around GCSEs. And I think that is a more truthful explanation for why things improve than people being overly generous. The next year was very different. The next year, the children were required to produce work all the way up until that last day that they were required to be in school. So there was no study leave, no exam leave. They got their heads down and they worked. And that was a really interesting year for us, because what it seemed to show was that for students that are traditionally slightly disadvantaged by exams, there was an improvement in performance and a closure of that gap. And that's something that I think is talked about a lot, and we really need to keep hold of in the talking to the DfE and the national picture in terms of assessment moving forward, because we do want our children and young people to have the best chances possible. And if they are, we have some clear evidence that a more assessment-based way of learning is less disadvantaged to some of our children, then I think that's something that we can take forward. So those were called teacher assessments. And again, there was another increase in grades, but actually our experience of year 11s was that they got their heads down and they absolutely worked their socks off. Everything was very much in the view of the classroom, in the view of the teachers, so there was none of the kind of horrible letting some children do their revision in environments that you absolutely know are not conducive to it, because it was all done in the classroom. So I think that the uptick again in terms of outcomes was again genuine, and was caused by the fact that the children could pour their kind of hearts into things that they could immediately see the results of. So things went up again. Unfortunately, what has gone up needs to come down. So it has been shared that the 2022 outcomes will be mapped to be lower, and then the 2023 ones will be mapped to be lower again, so that they match 2019 results. So in terms of children moving on to the next stage of their education, I don't think it will disadvantage them, because they're all in a peer cohort. However, in 10 years' time, if people look back, I think there will be an element of people not recalling which year of the pandemic the grades were gained in. So I think it is going to be a little bit tough on these kind of 2 years. But the thing which heartens me is that it won't stop them getting into the next stage of their educational training, which is the kind of most important point. So there's two key things in there, I think, that are worth holding on to. So the common challenges around this cohort's set of results. We've got over the country children that have had incredibly different experiences in terms of teachers being in school, not being in school, same across subjects, the same across children being in school, not being in school, long COVID. So actually, this set of outcomes arguably are more influenced by circumstance, in particular COVID circumstance, than influenced by the quality of teaching and learning going in. And so I think they're going to be a strange set of outcomes. The decision for Key Stage 2 outcomes, end of primary school outcomes, not to be published in performance tables, I think is a wise one, because people will obviously make judgments, and the judgments that they'll be making will be on the face value data, and there won't be the wealth of information surrounding it, which kind of explains what's happened. Unfortunately, at the moment, the decision is there to publish the Key Stage 4 data in performance tables, so that will be there for everybody to see. So I'm hoping that people that are speaking to influential people such as yourselves across the country are having this conversation so that everyone knows to just dig a little bit deeper rather than take things on face value. In terms of Ofsted, I think I'm going to pass over to Eric around Ofsted because it's his favourite topic of conversation. But it's a slightly strange environment for Ofsted to inspect in, because they've had to relinquish their reliance on data, and that's left a little bit of a gap, which Eric will explain.
Yeah, I think without wanting to dwell too long on it, the regulator Ofsted has for a while been saying it's not all about data, and we've welcomed that. It is about the curriculum experience. But the absence of data means that the way that Ofsted have inspected has been pretty mechanistic about curriculum, and largely it's been an inspection of curriculum plans, because it's quite difficult to assess in a day or two what the standards are that are being achieved, and partly the standards question has also been affected by the amount of COVID absence, whether that be the absence of the teacher, even though the children were in, which has been the experience of the last 3 months. It's not the absence of children that's been the issue, it's been the absence of the usual teacher, and the supply arrangements that's caused that disruption to the normal planned curriculum. And I think it's worth just emphasising again, teaching is a recursive and incremental thing. It's not an event. The unit of quality that leads to progress is not the lesson, it's the sequence of lessons, and it's whether the sequence of lessons builds on the previous sequence of lessons. So having staff absences is a real issue for that. Not for a day, but for 10 days, it absolutely is. Because you can't go back, you can't hold children, you can't stop children. So, but in terms of Ofsted, what we've got Ofsted outcomes focusing on the things they can measure easily. And the things they can measure easily are a bit mechanistic, they're a bit structural, in other words, looking at plans, saying we think you've got your stuff in the right order. Well, of course, the proof of that is whether children actually learn it. The absence of data on, even though that would only be in primary, on reading, writing and maths, therefore, it feels a little like a pause. And whilst nobody's talking about it, I'm quite sure Ofsted will be very interested in those standards when they're there again, and when there's also a longer time when children have had experience of the full curriculum. So the way Ofsted are undertaking inspections at the moment, I think it'll shift again in next term and next year, and we'll see what the impact of that is. So, I mean, lastly, and open to any questions you have on anything we've said. The reality is, for us as a school improvement service, this is what we know. We know schools are on it. There's always differentiation between individual institutions, and we know where that is, and we're working. But we have maintained our conversations with leaders. We have maintained our conversations with schools on which bits of curriculum would be most sensible to. If you can't teach it all, what would you teach in the best interest of children, in the best interest of transition? We provide professional materials to make sure that's the case. And equally, we've been working with termly visits to leadership. Now, some of those have been virtual, but actually a lot of them have continued being physical, where we have been challenging and supporting leaders on, are you still on it? How do you know? What is your assessment of where children are? How are you focusing your curriculum? So what we don't know is how that compares to how others have been doing it. And we also don't know this pupil level variation. So we're working hard and teachers are working hard, but slightly blindly as to what that might look like in a way that we're not comfortable with. We would normally know the range that it's going to land, but this feels a little less familiar. But I don't think we're alone, and it's not the Isle of Wight, it's Hampshire, it's every local authority.
Thank you, Natalie. We can only have two on at once. Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Eric. Any questions? Susie, Councillor Elective.
Thank you. I've got two questions after my interview. The first one I may have misunderstood. When you were speaking about attendance and saying that it was higher during the pandemic, or it was higher than national during the pandemic, was it also higher during the pandemic than it is in normal times on the island? And if so, what lessons have we learned to keep that going forward?
Attendance dropped everywhere through the pandemic, so it wasn't higher on the island than it was normally. If there was the same drop, but the drop was less. So there were more children in school on the Isle of Wight relative to the national picture, and that's a difference because previously attendance has been an uphill struggle for some time. So we're hoping very much that all of that work that went in will sustain and make the attendance across non-pandemic times, continue to improve relative to national.
Thank you. And the other one is probably not this one. It was speaking about areas of the curriculum that are missing, which obviously we'd expect to see that. And you've said, and I'm sure that you all are working extremely hard to address it. How are you able to do that, considering that there's still staff going off ill and that sort of thing?
Yeah, and there are the two things, aren't there? So we've been making sure that the advice and guidance that schools are getting is supporting them to make good curriculum choices. What we can't control is the individual teacher and class experience, because that is just dependent upon absence and so on. However, by continuing the focus in teaching on making sure that teachers play what's in front of them, not what's in a plan, by focusing back, then if there is an interruption, teachers are starting back with what have children experienced and where are they. We just can't stop that having a delay. In fact, it would be counterproductive. I've been absolutely clear. We have been really clear with schools. We do children no service whatsoever to have them skinnily gripping onto bits of curriculum by their fingertips, because it evaporates at the next key stage. When children go to secondary school, because they've been coached, bombarded, pushed, given a very thin version of the curriculum, even to the point where they can pass a test question. Trust me, that's not where they'll be in 3 months after that. So it's better to be sure of the curriculum you have and make sure that the receiving schools know what that curriculum is, because in the end, as important as statutory outcomes in Key Stage 2 are, nobody shows their SAT results to their employer to get a job. Okay, nobody passes their scaled score on to anyone. It is a means to progression in education, and if we keep our eye on the progression of education and the learning of curriculum that enables children to continue to make that progression, so we get the impressive progression figures we get, that is the outcome of education across the phases.
And moving into the secondary, where you do have to show your employers, you will probably have seen, because it was reported nationally just before half term, a set of topics that would be in the final GCSE exams was published, and it is a narrower range of topics in maths, science. So the intention behind that was that it would be published late, because the intention was that schools would teach as much as possible before focusing down onto this narrower range of key things that they wanted children to focus on in their revision. What it does is it gives a more level playing field, and I've had a really good look through the science ones, and it's very much that they have preserved the biggest building blocks needed for A-level study. So they've done actually, I think, quite a good thing there, because they won't be disadvantaging children in terms of being behind when they go into the next stage of their education if they choose A levels, but they have levelled the playing field and allowed them to concentrate on a smaller range of topics. We set up that, of course, in terms of teacher workload, means that they're having to revise all of the content that they would usually teach between now and the exam. So it's a lot of work for them. So we've supported them by setting up a seminar for each subject where our advisors have done that piece of work for them and share that in the seminars with them. So some schools will have done it already, they'll have done it over the half term, they'll have done their own work, but for those that need supporting, those seminars were there. And I know that some schools have found that really helpful in terms of what we were talking about with teacher absence and schools having different stresses and strains. So there's and that has been mirrored in A level too.
Any other questions? Councillor Shirley and then Councillor Critchinson.
Oh, I just turn on. Some, you got those on?
Just shout.
Okay, I'll shout. So I just wanted to focus back on the smaller groups of children, because that's really interesting to me, and the fact that you spoke about you're in contact with the DfE, obviously, about how they progressed. So there's obviously a case for smaller classes still. However, I know schools have budgets and all those constraints with it. But what will you be saying to the DfE? We need smaller classes. Is there a case for that?
So in terms of class size, the research in normal times is that if you had to put your money somewhere, you wouldn't spend it all on smaller class size, because actually it's the quality of teaching. If you're in a small class but with a not very good teacher, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter how big.
At all. So given that we obviously are about spending public money in areas where it had, bang for buck. However, if there was a limitless source, why on earth wouldn't we have smaller class sizes? But if you have half class sizes, which is what we had during lots, roughly, it varied, about 50% attendance, well, that's double the number of teachers then, and double the number of school classrooms in order to accommodate that. So that is a massive investment. So I think what we're taking from it is the kind of, and I think this comes back to the vulnerable children, because I think you asked a question about what we learned from attendance and can we hang on to it. It was the relationship and the human contact that was established with some of our quieter, vulnerable in the broadest sense. I don't like the word vulnerable really, because it makes children in some way incapable or afflicted or disabled by their needs. But what we generally in that, there are all kinds of reasons why children do not engage as well as other children, and smaller, more personal contact. Now, teachers can carry that forward in their approaches to teaching and go, oh, well, maybe teaching from the front and not getting around and talking with children and finding out what's inside their heads. Can't do it for as long, but we're hoping that that pedagogy drive, as we would call it, the kind of skills of teaching, we have been talking about that for the last 10 years. But that's how you get progress.
Brilliant.
I think it was a revelation to some teachers in terms of that personal contact and understanding that if you invest in getting to know children, which they had the opportunity to, then you can make significant progress. And where we are really pleased is where that has been carried forward. So,
and that's where you've seen the biggest changes in those children.
Yeah, I think as well, it's not, one of the things that is really important that schools do is prepare children for life after they've left, and life after they've left isn't always really small groups. So actually surviving in the context of a classroom and in a school is a really important skill to give children. So you wouldn't actually want the kind of small group, really tiny group, no other children there for the lifetime of a child in the school, because it just wouldn't do that preparation for the next stage. So there's a
realise
balance.
they'd be younger and you give older children more autonomy to make decisions, etc.
Yeah.
I think the other, just briefly to check, but it's always trickier than you want it to be, isn't it? Of course, unfortunately, lockdown teaching using remote education with all the children very compliant and the end of a screen has also given teachers what we think is an inaccurate bit of feedback, which is actually, if you just talk a lot and have lessons online for 3/4 of an hour, and children all seem to get it. So we're also trying to help them remember that that was lockdown teaching and it's a flawed model, not. So we actually have to try and remind them of this more sophisticated model. Because remember, quite a lot of teachers were at home for long periods, not in school with the vulnerable children. And so there's been a differential experience, I think, that we're trying to help the profession understand and take care of.
You might have already answered some of these things through this, but obviously, can this time be used as a kind of reset to get our attainment higher now that we're sort of going back into it with different styles of and the learning that we've got? So maybe that we can, I don't know, understand a lot about Ofsted and things like that, but is there a way we can now increase our attainment with that through looking at different ways of teaching now?
So I think in primary, the focus on early reading, the focus on needing to explore where children's gaps are, that was our strategy for improving the outcomes on the Isle of Wight in any case, from where we were back at the beginning of the partnership. That has been the focus for our professional development. So there is a continuation of that. If I'm frank, the bit that makes me nervous is we have made, using those techniques, we've made a very specific improvement in maths that was in terms of primary outcomes, the stone that was dragging down the combined figure, because you have to get reading, writing and maths, and if maths is lower than the other two, it's the lowest of their achievement that defines whether you, and we have lots of children on the Wight getting 2 of those subjects at age-related expectations, but because of maths. We made massive strides in that. The last thing I would have wanted is for us to then not know where we were for 2 years on that. So I'm nervous about that, but we have continued with our messaging, and we have, but of course, teachers will have changed in 2 years. We've got teachers who have never done SATs before, teachers who weren't teaching 2 years ago, they've come into the profession, so there's a churn. And you wouldn't want the system to let go of something for 2 years and then so we'll have to see where we are. We're doing the things we could do. But I think the broader point you make is exactly right. The kind of teaching and learning is the kind of teaching and learning that makes the most progress, and that's for certain.
Just a comment on that, because I did actually live through the whole, I had 2 key stage 2 children through lockdown and found different ways that they learned, and I had my older daughter liked smaller groups in maths online. Now she's back in a big class bit, she's gone back down again. So it's seeing how they actually react to those different types was really interesting. So I'm sure we've all learned a lot.
Thank you, Dan. There's a lot of information, and it's a question I always ask you. That's a hell of a lot of reporting in there. Does the process of providing that report stop you doing some of the work you want to do? Is one question. You don't have to answer that now particularly. Just a couple of things from me. I know, Natalie, you said school is the best place for a child. I think they'd probably argue that an ice cream factory might be preferable. But there was just a couple of things about that. Do teachers still have to do a learning styles lesson plan for every lesson? So, you know, kinesthetic and whatever it is.
I think we have moved away from that kind of rigid construct to focusing on children and learning. So if you are working with a leader in a school to assess the success of what's happening, what you'll do is look at the children and how much they've learned relative to what you've intended that they learn, how much they've remembered, and Ofsted is also lined up in that way, which is very useful because it's much more focused on where you want children to end up and much less focused on have you written into all the boxes on a piece of paper. So this is a good thing.
No, I agree. I agree, because it's a while since I've been in a school watching lesson plans, but it was just around those, from what you're saying, it sounds like teachers have gone and started doing those teaching styles in amongst a group of 30 kids without realising that, you know, 5 of them learn that way, another 6. Again, lots in that report. There's a lot of wide questions, which I won't bore you with now, but I think I read between the lines, Eric, and this is meant as a compliment, nothing else, that you are warning there's a potential problem coming in terms of reasons for different levels of attainment. Sorry, that wasn't meant badly, just the factors influencing around what you were saying about. The good thing is there's no patterns, because I'd be concerned if there were patterns, because that would make no sense. But my concern as well about the change in Ofsted and the reintroduction of exams, we're going back to the forcing a certain amount to fail, because it's like the system can't accept that tags were good enough, which they were. And that does concern me. And you don't have to answer it, feel free to if you want to, but it does worry me a bit.
I think the vulnerability, and I think comes out of the report, is at an individual pupil, it worries me greatly that a school or a parent might feel that their child is in some way behind because what the assessment, and that's the thing that worries me the most, that children move on to the next stage of their education from you know, it's a key stage 2 to a key stage 3 question from primary to secondary with a tag that says you're not rather than you are, and you're right. The system expects and limits the number of children who are allowed to be. Now, it might be that because the system wants a number to be not too low, more children are given that than probably compared to 2019 would have got it in 2019. We don't know which way it will go, but it won't be limitless. It's not like cycle proficiency. There are a certain number, and if you're not as good as the other 70%, you won't be allowed through with an age-related tag, and it worries me individual. The vulnerability from inspection and outcomes around an institution is, if you've just happened to have that mix of children, then your combined outcomes are going to be not what you normally have, are out of kilter, and of course that's going to need some accounting for. It's going to be quite hard for that not to sound like excuses, you know, reasons rather than excuses. For the Isle of Wight, it's the size of the number of schools. You know, in terms of, you know, if I compare Hampshire with this, and it's not a standards thing, there's so many schools in Hampshire, we would expect the kind of peaks and troughs to wash out. When you've got a smaller number of schools in the system, even nationally, the peaks and troughs might wash out. But when you've got a smaller system, you could be at one end, you could be further from the norm of that fluctuation, and that's if you like the concern. And lastly on that, the concern is that doesn't become a distraction from doing the right thing. That's what we're going to need to keep our focus on, doing the right thing. They'll be what they'll be, and of course we'll learn from them, but we need to learn the right things from them. And I think a lot of that learning we've already got.
Thank you. I found it very interesting. I don't know everyone else. I think attainment is, as a parent, it worries everybody, doesn't it? It certainly worries children. Something that is quite nice, and is probably just for our own entertainment, is the magic wand bit. If you can put that into every report, just because it gives us an idea, because we know that you have your own ideas, and I know we can't change a lot on this committee, but it is quite nice to hear where your minds are at. So feel free to add that onto the 2 remaining. So, any other questions, or should we move on? Oh, Dave, Councillor Evans.
Do you mind if I don't turn this on? Can you hear me okay? I have a problem with these tags and these CAGs. It's at what stage, I believe I raised this question last time in the last meeting, I just have concerns over this manipulation of the figures. At what stage do we make the pupils reset an exam to see exactly where they are? Because to me, that's the benchmark. And I don't want to, don't get me wrong, I'm not having a pop at the teachers or anything. The teachers should know the children best, without a doubt. But I believe the children need to be tested. And I just have concerns, at what stage do we actually take a reading of where they're at?
Well, this year we're going back to exams, so we've gone back to the old style. And actually, in terms of the CAGs and the tags that happened for the last 2 years, they were very much imposed. So there were many opinions around the correctness of them, but the best thing to do really was just to get your heads down and get on with it, because that's how you were going to best benefit the children. I'm not sure if you were asking a kind of more philosophical question about children being able to demonstrate how they can do their best, but also needing to be tested so that there's that kind of measure.
I just believe with the exam, when you sat the exam,
Yeah.
when I went to school, we was graded on that exam. And I think that surely must be the benchmark. So at what stage do we forget all this manipulating the figures and we sit the children down and say, okay, we know they've had a problem 2 years, we all appreciate that. I mean, I went to school over the back of my house where I lived, got to school. And the kids weren't there. They've had problems with the teachers. I've known children myself at school age, but I know it's like the neighbourhood with the kids, every other week the children were being sent home, the class was shut down, obviously that creates problems. Then teachers wasn't turning up, and I appreciate that. But I just think at some stage, and the sooner the better, at what stage do we test them? Are we intending to test them again and get that reading of where they are with the GCSE level? Are we intending to do that?
Yeah, that's
that's happening this summer. So this summer, all Key Stage 2, so Year 6 end of primary school, and all end of secondary school, and all end of sixth form children go back to a traditional exam system where they sit exams, and those are reported on in August.
And on those figures, but are those figures when those exams are taken, are they going to be manipulated in this up and down thing? Are they going to be, because that's what's concerning me. Why are we not just going to get a true figure of where they would have been at? Because to me, surely that's the guide of where they should have been or where they are. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. The truth of the matter is that it actually has happened every year since exams were invented. Every year they have to make sure that the exam results fit a certain pattern. Within that, there is some tolerance built in for improved cohorts, but it's very small. So whatever you think of it, and whatever all the people around the table think of it, because I'm sure everyone will have very different opinions, it's happened every year since the exam started, and what happens this year will be exactly what you're after in terms of they will all have tests, and it will actually be exactly what you're kind of saying in terms of benchmarks, but the benchmarks will shift slightly up and down as they do every year to make sure that the results do what they think that they need to do.
I'll just come in on that, just to try and illustrate it. Brian Pope's predecessor, John Clark, always used to have this quote, which was that every year the world record for the 10,000 metres comes down by a few seconds, to which the conclusion can only be that the race is getting shorter. Or there's another conclusion, which is people are getting better at it. So, and there's something in that about the way that we test children. And actually, if you've been teaching the curriculum for a number of years, and the curriculum doesn't really change, you get better at teaching it. And you actually, so you should see children learn more. And get better. So that's it. And the other thing I just wanted to say, Chair, you asked about whether these reports were going on the activity. They've got a really pernickety director of children's services who asked that.
That's accepted, and that's fair.
So it's fine.
Thank you for that. If we move on then to elective home education.
Hello, everyone, hear me all right? Hello, I'm John Wilcox, I'm the Inclusion Support Service Manager. I had the great pleasure of joining you in September of this last year when I replaced Dave Harvey. I've got with me Rachel Williams, who manages the team here on the island. I had panic this morning when Brian told me he wasn't coming, so I grabbed Rachel very quickly and she very kindly agreed to come with me. I just want to sort of go through my PowerPoint with you. So it won't be a surprise to you that there's been a rise in the elective home education population, both on a national scale but also on a local scale. And we would agree and we would understand that that's largely an impact of COVID as a contributing factor. There was a government consultation called Children Not in School, and that's proposed some legislative change And at the moment, we're anticipating that there will be a requirement for parents who choose to electively home educate their children to register them with the local authority. And until now, that hasn't existed, and that's a massive step and gear change. And another massive step and gear change, which you may well have heard about, and it's certainly been an extensive topic in the press, there's been a recent judicial review in Portsmouth, which was published at the end of November last year. And that really is very likely to have some influence on future legislative change, particularly in relation to the role of local authorities. I think over the next 12 months, as a team on the island, we will need to look at kind of the impact of what that change in legislation and guidance arising from the judicial review will mean in terms of the elective home education of children on the island. And one of the things that we'll be focusing on is making sure that arrangements are proportionate and sensible, and that they allow local authorities to focus on families who are most at risk and need the most support to provide suitable education. So again, it's very much about a needs-led model. I think when we look at statistics, we did a bit of number crunching earlier. We couldn't avoid it really. As of today, there's 507 children on the Isle of Wight that are electively home educated, and that contributes 3.4% of that school-based community. I think it's really important to say that in February of each year there is a spike on the island in terms of the number of children who decide to electively home educate, and that is to do with the fact that after 6 months of being electively home educated, they are entitled to access some of the college courses that are provided. And what that actually does is it leads families sometimes to time when they're going to decide to actually home educate. So I just wanted to kind of just give you that subtle pointer, and some of you may know this anyway, particularly those of you who've had strong links with the very strong EHE community on the island. So I think very much our next 12 months will be about planning, responding, and being strategic in terms of working on relating to those expected changes. In 2020-21, the academic year, there were 669 children electively home educated at some point. There are some interesting statistics around that, and I shared those with you in the report. But it's important to say that there's been an increased turbulence in the elective home education population. In the autumn term of 2021, we saw 106 children become electively home educated, and 99 of those returned to school. There was a 161% increase in the number leaving the HE compared to the same period of 2019 to 20. And again, I will draw your attention to what we've been through in the last 2 years, and that's a significant impact on young people and their families, many of which you'll be very familiar with that situation yourselves. So there was a 161% increase in the number of children that left EHE compared to this time last year. And the increase in children leaving EHE may be an indication that parents are starting to return their children to school following the easing of COVID-19 restrictions and the rollout of the vaccination. Most children in EHE are unsurprisingly in the secondary sector, and in 2020 to 2021 there was 4.9% in secondary compared to a figure of 2.3% in primary. The largest group within the EHE community will not surprise you that it's year 11. At the end of the autumn term 2021, 5.9% of EHE pupils had an EHCP, compared to 4.9% of the school population. And that's, when I say school population, I mean aged 5 to 16 on the Isle of Wight. It's also important to note a figure that 4% of EHE pupils were open to social care at the end of the autumn term in 2021, compared to 4.8% of the school population on the Isle of Wight in July 2020. When we're looking at this, and Steve's quite rightly said, it's really important for us to reflect when we're writing these reports on what's actually happening and to unpick it in detail. And one of the things that we look at is the reasons that parents give that they decide to electively home educate. In autumn term 2020, it will be unsurprising to you that COVID-19 concern was the most common reason for choosing elective home education, with 23.9% of those stating that reason. In the autumn term 2021, this significantly reduced to 8.5%, and I think that reflected society's position in terms of return to school, in the way in which schools were dealing with that, and in terms of the vaccination rollout programme. In 2021, the most common reason was emotional and physical health, and that came out at 36.8%. We still believe that COVID is a significant reason in this decision making, and the impact of COVID-19 also on young people's emotional health. I'm sure you'll have heard much in the news about that. It's really important for us as a team to engage with families. As a result of the COVID-19 restrictions at the time, because of those restrictions, most home visits were replaced by telephone calls, email reports, and virtual meetings. And overall, parents have engaged very well with this. And you'll be well aware on the island that there's an extremely strong relationship between the council, the local authority team, and also with parent groups and bodies. And we maintain that strong relationship is a massive positive contributing factor, all about relationships. New families generally require an additional level of support, and therefore the high level of transition into HE has had an impact on staffing capacity. During the autumn term 2021, the HE team made contact with 80% of families new to EHE or due for a review, and that's a strong figure and one that we're proud of. So in conclusion, there has been a significant increase in EHE during the academic year 2021, but this appears to be now levelling off this academic year. Again, I did talk about the fact that we do get a spike during February and the reasons for that. Work will need to be undertaken to ensure readiness to meet the expected changes in both legislation and guidance, and we're already starting to think about that and work with other authorities. Increase with both local and national, and COVID-19 is believed to be a strong contributory factor, and also we will eagerly await those changes to legislation and guidance that will arise from the Good Red versus Portsmouth judicial review.
Thank you, John. Any questions? So far, thank you, Councillor Arrow.
Thank you. Quick question which actually crosses over from your subject and the attainment as well, because I nearly raised it previously, but I wanted to hear what you had to say, John. It's in relation to the attendance figures, the improvement that's been seen in the attendance figures, whether there's a correlation between the number of individuals who have now taken up home education, who may have been some of those individuals who would have poorer attendance. I was wondering whether there was any correlation in that regard.
Do you want to go first?
No, you go.
No, you go first, and I'll copy what you've said.
No, that's cheating. You're not allowed to, John.
I think the way that I'll answer that is, and it comes from actually some work that I've done with the team, with individual families and cases. I think there are always families that will choose to electively home educate because they believe they can do it best, and it suits the needs of their children. And that's one, I think, what I would call very stable, static cohort in terms of numbers. And then there are those families that find themselves in very difficult situations. There are those children, I've got 2 stepsons and 2 of my own children. Some of them have wanted to return to school and some have not. And I think what we've noticed that in some cases, those families that find themselves in tricky, difficult circumstances, we feel that sometimes the pressure of getting those children to school, to attend, can be a contributory factor to the parent making the decision to electively home educate. And I think what's really important is the work that the team does in supporting schools to have the conversations with the parents and with the children about how they can support them in school in order to keep them in school. And when I say that, I mean that in the most positive sense, that actually there are some children and some families where they are vulnerable, that actually that elective home education decision is not necessarily made around, if you like, the pedagogy and the practice of teaching a child at home, but more to avoid the difficulties of getting them to attend school. So again, I think we've been very sensitive on the island, but also equally so in Hampshire, to make sure that we support schools in interrogating those decisions in the most supportive of manners, to make sure that actually the decision is right for the child and for the family. So I think really what does cross over is the work of the attendance team and the work of the HE team to actually look at those situations. And we're also sensitised to those situations where children may be demonstrating their difficulties with life in terms of their behaviour at school. So again, working with families that have faced suspensions or exclusions, and we'll come on to that in the next report, it's again about that joined-up thinking. And again, you know, that crossover with social care is really important. So for me, it's very much about communicating, not just within the service, but across services, and making sure that we work closely with schools to put the right support in. And it's not around dissuading parents to make that decision around elective home education, but to look at the bigger, I suppose, the bigger picture of the child and the family. And I think that's very much in officers' minds, particularly when working and supporting schools. And I think it's about knowledge and understanding. I think, you know, all of us in this room have been on an enormous learning curve, just as human beings, never mind our families, with what's happened in the last 2 years. And I think what I'm seeing is a temperance and a degree of empathy and a degree of understanding, not just amongst officers, but also amongst teachers in schools and other adults around the difficulties that some children have faced in returning to school. It hasn't been easy. And I think, you know, Natalie sees it and Eric will see it. There's incredible work going on within the classroom, but also within the school building to make those children feel supported and welcome, and to put that support in place. And I think there's a word that we use in the team a lot, or 2 words, and it's about creativity and flexibility, and being able to adapt to build a programme of support that suits the individual. And I think the one thing that COVID has probably taught all of us is that ability that we've got to adapt to survive. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. If you want to add anything, please do.
I was going to go for a maths response, so I think you lucked in with the proper response. And the EHE numbers are so small that they don't affect the top line of attendance very much. So if you were asking from a maths point of view about that number, they're too small to affect it. So if you've got a school and it has a child that has really low attendance, even a big secondary school, and it then drops out, it doesn't make very much difference to the overall attendance figure at all. It's because there are so many children.
Thank you.
You've got a really comprehensive set of responses now.
I like the maths bit as well. That's good. I'm very happy with that.
Any other questions? Councillor Christian.
Thank you. My only concerns from people that I've spoken to over the years has been about children with special educational needs not getting the assessments they want and finding that their only option is to take their children out and do it themselves and let the child learn at their own speed, because the targets were stopping the child from actually progressing. And I just wondered what sort of support we're giving to those parents that do then feel that they've got to take their children out and do the home educating.
That is, when I hear that is one of the saddest things that I hear, because schools ideally should be able to meet the needs of the children within them. A massive portion of our work is helping, and the picture is not perfect, it is helping schools to meet the needs of the children that attend them. And things have got much better. This is a nationwide issue, not just an Isle of Wight or Hampshire issue, but they're not perfect. There are some genuine cases where parents believe very strongly that they know or they think that something is right for their child, which education professionals have a slightly different opinion about, and it generally centres around preparing for adulthood, where, you know, a strong theme that runs through what we do is to help children prepare for adulthood. But the majority of cases, I think, truly are where schools are not properly meeting the needs of children with special educational needs, and that is a massive portion of our work that is not yet finished.
Thank you for that. I think, as well as SEND, I think children with neurodiverse issues really struggle, probably not more on the island, I wouldn't be able to say in terms of statistically, but I think the massive jump from primary to secondary is really felt on the island, because it's not that many years ago we had a 3-tier system, and that does seem to be quite, and I know the numbers are small for EHE, but that does seem to be quite a big factor, is that big jump. But in terms of the response from EHE families to the new legislation, what sort of response have you had? Are they worried? Is it likely to cause more work or problems?
It's a really good question. I think it's very difficult at the moment to formulate that opinion. I think most families are waiting to see what the legislation says, what the guidance will be. There's been a really diverse reaction within the Portsmouth community to that judgment, even within local authorities. I think there will be a welcome by local authorities to be able to unpick the quality of education in greater detail. But I think that's around ensuring what's very best for young people. So I think everyone's heart's in the right place. It may not necessarily meet in terms of that kind of opinion. So at the moment, it's difficult to gauge. I think everybody's waiting to see, and that would be my honest response at the moment. Yeah, you can.
Please do it.
I think it's difficult to determine because I think the families that we have contact with at the moment are the ones that want to engage with the local authority, and so perhaps the responses we're getting may not be representative of the whole of the EHE community, because the ones that perhaps don't want to speak to the local authority are the ones that may have differing opinions on the guidance coming in.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I guess part of the reason for the registration is to not lose any kids between the cracks, which, given the events of the last year or so, makes a lot of sense. Any other questions? Smashing. Thank you for that. Oh, sorry, Steve. I keep missing.
It's fine. It's on the your buttons. We've got really good coverage on the Isle of Wight, and there are places that are really killed for this sort of coverage in terms of knowing the children that are actually home educated, and it's something to do with obviously the island boundary, and that can give us a lot of confidence that we are much less likely to have children slip through the cracks than perhaps in other areas.
That's a good point.
So, I'm going to pull on next time and just share moving on, in school exclusions, is that you again, John?
It's me again.
You get all the best jobs.
Apologies, yeah. So on to a sort of separate topic now, exclusions. You'll realise the reasons for exclusions can be many and they can be complex. But it's important to know that the Department of Education has launched a consultation in response to the Timpson review, and that runs between the 3rd of February and runs out on the 31st of March. One of the things I want to sort of draw your attention to quickly was that there are many different contributory factors. So obviously we know about levels of deprivation and their subsequent impact. We know about levels of emotional health and well-being, and something that's very much a topic within the press at the moment. We also are more and more aware and more able to cater with the impact of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as we call them. We're also aware of the constant need to build a positive culture of inclusivity in schools, both primary and secondary. We're also, and we talked about a lot in this meeting, aware of the need for high quality teaching and learning, and the quality of high quality school leadership and the stability of school staff. So all of those factors are things that are contributing factors in a positive way. In terms of key statistics, the national data has not yet been released for the academic year 2021. The use of permanent exclusions is reflective of the national comparator. And in the academic term 2019 to 20, it was 0.6%, which is actually level with the national. The rate of suspension, however, is above the national average, and in the academic term 2019 to 20, it was 5.07% locally compared to 3.7% nationally, 7.6%, sorry. The use of suspension is higher in the secondary sector and than in the primary, which is more consistent with the national average. For the academic year 2019 to 20, the rate of suspension for Isle of Wight children eligible for free school meals was higher than the national average, and that was at 10.34% compared to a national figure of 9.37%. The data also shows that the use of suspension for children with an EHCP was lower than the national average, which was at 10.07% compared to 11.71% for the national. For children with SEN but no EHCP, the Isle of Wight rates were higher than the national, which was at 13.87% compared to 11.07%. We're always very interested in the reasons for suspensions. And you may be interested to know that verbal abuse against or threatened behaviour towards an adult has consistently been one of the main reasons for suspension on the island. However, this is not replicated nationally. Persistent disruptive behaviour, or PDB, is consistently one of the more frequently used reasons, both on the Isle of Wight and also nationally. The option of other was removed in 2020 to 2021, and it is anticipated that this will lead schools to an increase in the term PDP, or persistently disruptive behaviour, as a reason for suspension, both locally and nationally. So, strategies to increase inclusion. This is the most important part of this presentation. The Isle of Wight Local Authority uses a range of strategies to increase inclusion in schools, and there's a massive focus at the current time amongst the team. This includes an emphasis on early intervention and prevention. It's around multi-agency planning and joint working, which is a very strong feature. A support for positive reintegration, and by that we mean welcoming children back to school with support and guidance, and also working with parents. Support and constructive challenge of schools on their use of exclusions. That's around rigorous conversations with head teachers and also with governing bodies about what they're doing and why. It's also around outreach support from the ILC and also the special schools. At the moment, we're working together, we'll be doing some of it today, on developing training for schools and governing bodies to go into targeted schools to work with them, with both head teachers, senior leadership teams and governing bodies around the use of exclusions and how to prevent them. Also, analysis and sharing of data and improving data collection is a strong feature of the work that we're doing at the moment. In other words, having a handle on what's going on so that we can work with schools to target improvement. To support early intervention, the method for the collation of data of suspension was changed from September 2021. Now data is received quicker, in a quicker time frame than previously, and helps to inform us, particularly with regard to vulnerable children, where the data can be analysed quickly and can inform intervention. It must be important to note that the data is not verified and may be subject to change, but can be used to help identify trends, areas of strength and areas of improvement. So in other words, we're harvesting and collecting data live, quicker, and it enables us to target intervention at a speedier rate. An area of vulnerability that's previously been difficult to analyse is the CSE status, so children social care status. However, the new data collection methods enable us to do so, and this is a massive step forward, particularly when identifying and working with vulnerable children and families. So in conclusion, there is a potentially detrimental impact on children who are excluded from school, and work is ongoing to reduce the use of exclusions, whilst maintaining good levels of discipline in schools. Any findings that are released from the current consultation will need to be considered in the work of the team in the future.
Thank you, John. Any questions for John? I'm sure this is, yes. Councillor Christensen, you're in quick.
There we go. So I was looking at the figures in point 25 on the table in there with the vulnerable groups and the PHCP level of suspensions, and it seems very high. And I'm guessing with the other figures you gave us in here about the SEN figures being higher than nationally as well. Is it that it's not best serving the needs of the island children now in those the curriculum in those levels, and that's what's causing that, I'm guessing, the disruptions in class, and it's not providing what they need. So that's leading to this.
I think my answer would be that given the nature of what children have been through in the last 2 years, and some of the things that we've talked about before in terms of attendance and the HE and adjusting to being back in school, I think those children that find school more challenging and more difficult sometimes replicate that in the way in which they respond in their behaviour. And I think in some ways schools are learning very quickly to adapt and accommodate those children that find learning more difficult. And again, you know, creativity, flexibility, the things that both Natalie and Eric have talked about in the way in which the curriculum is being delivered. I believe from what I see, and I do get into schools very regularly, that both teachers and senior leadership teams are adapting the way that they do business to accommodate the needs of those children who are most vulnerable and who find school most challenging. I feel that these figures replicate that challenge that they face, particularly on the return to school. And I think one of the things that the team is doing is harvesting and collecting data, particularly by breaking it down by category, so that it's live and it's useful. And I think sharing that with schools and sharing that with head teachers means that they can focus their school improvement on those children that most need it, particularly in the way in which, again, to use that phrase, they do the business of teaching and learning. Is there anything you want to add?
I think that it's something that we are working very hard on and needs to get better. It's not, I'll give you an example of some work that we've done recently with a child that had a number of suspensions, very, very young child, because the school was finding it very difficult to manage the behaviour of that child, who also had a special educational need. And the way that the approach was to that was to get a team around the school together and then a team around the child together. So it involved a significant amount of input from, I think 6 different agencies, and then a really detailed plan that involved the staff and the leadership of the school in changing an awful lot about teaching, learning and curriculum so that they better met the needs of the child. Now, that was a lot of learning required by everyone there, and it's not learning that I think anyone before the lockdown would have had, because these are new situations all the time. So I'm not going to pretend that it's a quick or an easy fix, but what I can say is that there are some very dedicated professionals that are absolutely committed to making it right for those children in school. Not all heads are on the same page with it. I'll be brutally honest with you. Some of them would rather those children, were in somebody else's school. But, we are working with them. And I would say that on the Isle of Wight, there is a more evolved collegiality between heads. So I think it will, as often happens, move more quickly than perhaps in a larger local authority. The other thing that happens as well, as John will, is that we find it very easy to share stories and case studies such as that, and that really encourages people, because it is difficult and they have been through a very difficult time. So, going that extra mile at a point when they've hardly got any staff and isn't as easy as it might be, but it is, as I said and described, something that people are very focused on.
And just to come back on something Natalie said, something that I've noticed very recently that is immensely encouraging is that where there is best practice in individual schools, senior leaders and staff are very keen to come forward and work with other schools to show what they've done with very tricky cases. And that's a culture shift. To give you an illustration, I went out to 2 schools recently this week to ask them if they could showcase some work they've done on attendance with some very difficult, vulnerable young people, and they're chomping at the bit to share. So I think that collegiality is a paradigm shift. And I think, I feel for the local authority, the door is open. Natalie's absolutely right. We're doing some robust work with some heads at the moment who would like to move children that are difficult to other schools. But we'll get there with them because we'll be relentless in that cause. So I hope that answers the question.
Also, if you just the other bit on this, if you take a longer view, sorry, I've done that again, haven't I? If you take a longer view on this, looking back about 10 years, the attendance on the Isle of Wight about 7 8 years ago was appalling. It was off the scale in terms of the national against the national average. And some of you will remember that. Attendance now is within the proper distribution curve. So of course, what was happening previously, you had sort of self-exclusion, if I can put it that way. Well, now we've actually got the kids in school, but there's a process of learning about how to manage that. So, if you take a long view, it's all part of that process, I think.
Finally, Eric, you get a chance.
I'll segue in on the very helpful introduction.
Nicely done.
Because it's also just a point that's sometimes missed. So there is a revolution going on in teacher training. And it's happened in the last 10 years. And I'll come back to something you said, Councillor Bickley, which is about learning styles.
So learning styles came from a piece of work done by Hal Gardner about different learning preferences. Had absolutely no evidence base on impact on attainment progress. Doesn't mean it didn't have some truths in it. So what's happened in the last 10 years, and grows pace every single year, is what is guiding teachers' practice. From what I learned my practice by copying a teacher. The problem is I copied all of the things that the teacher had. And they had copied the teacher before, and they copied the teacher before, and they copied the teacher. Well, frankly, we now know about neuroscience. We understand how children's brains work. We understand how learning works. We understand how teaching works. We can make connections. And knowing is not just a, well, I've noticed it, so it must be true. It's actually, this is an empirical study, and there are a variety of ways that we could respond to this. And then teachers are action researching from proper findings to see if they can make that work in their practice. So there was a secret garden. If you were an athlete 10 years ago, someone looked at your muscles, understood how your body worked, understood the training that was required, did the right exercise in the right way, paid attention to you in detail. If you were a teacher, you carried on teaching how the teacher you learned to teach from had put that in front of you and hoped that it would stick. So we're at a paradigm shift in the profession, and that is as much around not just understanding needs exist, that's always been that, but understanding what you do about it. So what we're doing, our training, is evidence-based, research-based. It's not just a moral campaign, it's a pragmatic, practical. These are this, why would you do that? Not, that's not going to help, but that's not going to help. This is what helps, or this, try these, because that approach. Lastly, the challenge we have is the research is really clear. It takes 3 to 5 years to embed professional practice. Goes back to my maths nervousness. We had 1 year, and then the next 2 got written off. So it takes 3 to 5 years to embed practice. So a lot of the behaviours that we need teachers to adopt are hard. They're hard thinking. They're breaking behaviours and habits that teachers have got, and they're easy to slip back from. And the challenge we have professionally is to keep not just the relentless moral campaign and the challenge, and that you can't do that, but also you can. It is possible. It is possible. And these are the things that you can do to do it. So I'm really hopeful, but it's not a fix that you can just turn it. I wish it was just, oh, if only they changed their minds, it would be better. It's not going to work like that. It's hard work. But I'm hopeful. I really am.
Thank you. Thank you for the good news. As ever, I always say, what's the bad news? The figures around permanent exclusions, being the same as national averages, would imply that there's a fairly rigid framework to exclude someone. The quite significant difference in suspensions on the island, you're about a third higher in percentage terms, would imply that there's not such a rigid framework around suspensions. Now, the question is, it'd probably be quite handy to see a breakdown per school, not for a witch hunt, but to see what's going on. But the question is the fact that we have more exclusions nationally for verbal abuse against staff, is there perhaps a problem we're masking? How do I phrase the question? Is it an island-specific problem where we are, and are we? Do we respond in a different way than perhaps might happen nationally? That's the best way I can think to phrase that question.
I venture an opinion that the children on the island are no more rude than anywhere else.
Exactly. That's, as you can see, was struggling where I was trying to get to. So that would imply the problem actually doesn't lie with the children. The problem lies with the decision to suspend. And my concern is it looks like exclusions are used probably where they're absolutely necessary, because I'm guessing you guys really do challenge exclusions. The concern is that suspensions at certain schools may be used in the same way you might have said, go and stand outside of a squad, put your hands on your head and sing I'm a Little Teapot in the old days. So it's, again, back to the question, is it an island-specific problem with the schools that we're penalising kids when they're no different.
I think to answer that question, and Steve kind of answered, the children are no more rude than they are anywhere else. I think at the moment, to reassure you, there's some really rigorous conversations between the local authority and individual head teachers, where potentially we feel there's other ways of skinning the cat than necessarily a suspension. And I think that the common theme of the conversation is they're children that have already missed a lot of learning. They're children that actually want them in school because school's the best place for them. And I'm very confident that the rigorous conversations and the work that's been done by colleagues sat to my left is a fantastic benchmark of not being prepared to tolerate those figures being greater than the national. So I'm very assured that actually when we have this conversation the next time, you'll see significant improvement in those figures. It is about cultural change. It is about learning to do things differently, and as you know, Eric said very ably, it does take time to move people's mindsets. But I think that the robust, thorough, quantifiable nature of those conversations will bear fruit. So it's something that we're very much aware of. We do look at them school by school. We're very aware that there are significant differences. But you know, all the teams that are sat around the table here are working on that. And it will improve.
Excellent. I don't doubt for a minute that you'll make it. I guess my concern is that that's the sort of stuff as a committee we should be helping you with, and that's the stuff we should be driving, because that's where that to me is a big concern. Sorry, Natalie.
Yes.
Okay, when did you forget? But yeah, thank you for that. That's encouraging to hear. Any other questions, Councillor Lucia?
Still not working.
I'll try again.
I'm encouraged by what I hear, and so for me, it's about the old saying, some of those children that don't want to be at school, we're rewarding bad behaviour because they don't want to be there. But equally, younger, we don't want to label people as troublemakers because they may have other issues that you need to deal with. So I'm really encouraged, and I'm really looking forward to it coming back actually and seeing how that progresses.
Can I think it's possibly worth just saying that in this secondary education landscape, the system as a whole is significantly more functional than it was a number of years ago in terms of the people that have been able to be recruited, in terms of how they set their schools up, in terms of how they all work. Ofsted has not been our friend in an instance recently with this high number of suspensions, because there's a kind of, is it true, is it not true? I'm not going to offer an opinion, but as you rapidly improve schools in terms of behaviour and systems, it can be the case that suspensions go up. So one of the usual ways in which we are supported in our drive to make schools become more inclusive is Ofsted being the same voice in terms of looking at those. But they also allow a bit of slackness when schools have improved rapidly. So some of the high suspending schools are ones where there has been rapid and recent shifts in terms of, and that's how they're explaining it. But you can't carry on saying that for very long. So there's also that kind of working in our favour, because as you'll be aware, there's a space now before some of the secondary schools become Ofsteded, but all the data that's going into the system now will be what they're Ofsteded on. So, you know, you never do things in schools for Ofsted, but in this instance, they're working with us on this, and actually, you know, that will also, I think, be a driver to support our work in this area.
Thank you, and doubtless we'll review this in a year, won't we? Because I guess it's part of the year. There's not much point in asking for anything before. Are we able to see a breakdown by school, or do you think that's inappropriate?
I think we have another meeting, don't we, where I think that's probably absolutely right.
Yeah.
But because of the subtleties involved, I think perhaps for now, it should be there. Thank you.
I think just to add to what Natalie said, I think because of the work that's going on at officer level with individual schools and the training that we're going to do with governing bodies, I'd like to have time to do that work before we kind of start opening out a bigger debate, because I think it is about mind shift, it is about sensitivities, it is about partnership, and I think it's that those partnerships that we're building and really working hard at the moment could go either way.
No,
I
that's
think
fair.
it's about that confidentiality. And actually, I've got to be really honest, I think those schools are learning to trust us.
Yeah.
And I think we need to give them that symbolism of trust by allowing them to work with us in that sector.
That's a fair comment. Councillor Andre.
Thank you, just in brief, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Natalie. I'm aware of the panel to which you refer, which I'm chair, and I agree with you that I think that particular data would be more appropriate to be discussed at that panel. I'd be very happy to have that on the agenda. Thank you.
Councillor Adams.
I'd just like to add, I'm partly in agreement with Richard. I think, no disrespect to yourselves, I'm not sure about this confidentiality thing. I believe the parents should know what children are being excluded from where. I think that should be out there, because the schools can then be looked at and assessed on what's happening where, rather than this island figure. These figures are giving me causes for concern. The verbal abuse, persistent disruptive behaviour. And another question with this, and touching also on an earlier subject of the special educational needs. Are these children with the special educational needs, are they just grouped in with all the normal kids? Or are they broken down into groups and given special attention in a smaller group? Or are they just sold in amongst everyone else?
So perhaps I could pick that up from a primary point of view, first of all. First of all, we all have needs. Okay, so there are needs that every child, in fact, the whole of early years education is built on the idea of the unique child. So all practice should be looking at the individuality of children, but we can't teach 30 different ways. There's always going to be a rub between learning to work together. I mean, it's not a natural thing to put 30 individuals in a very small room and challenge them for 7 hours a day to learn new things. That's a really hard thing to do. So the reality is that when we talk about needs, there is a line drawn where we say, those are needs that are a bit more than you would expect a typical teacher to have the tools in normal work, not teaching children the same. We're way away from the pedagogy of a teacher just taught from the front one way, one style, but there already is a lot of diversity in that. When we reach children who the range of tools that teachers have to make the task different, to work with the child in a slightly different way, to pose the work in a slightly different way, starts to become, and it's the change of the resource, the particular kind of way that the resource is presented. Sometimes it includes another adult, but it doesn't have to be, but sometimes it's another adult in the room. So you then get to, if you like, the next layer of children who are absolutely part of us. If we were a class, some of us would need some bits of our learning to be addressed by having some other kinds of adaptation to them. The easy one to realise, to think about is, when you're visually impaired to a degree, you wear glasses, and we're all perfectly comfortable that you don't go out in the class and sit in a group with all the other children who can't see the board. You have an adaptation to see the board, and it's called wearing glasses or sitting a bit closer. And similarly if you're hard of hearing, or similarly if you are physically. The bit we get into trouble, the difficulty is the subtle unseen ones about it's your cognitive. It's about how you learn, and it's invisible, it's inside you. And sometimes you get behaviour to act out because it just can't make sense. You can only understand 3 instructions, or 2 instructions, not 4 or 5, so you're already lost. So those are much more subtle and difficult to get at. But largely, when they're understood, then actually teachers, and through the way they teach, can make that provision, and we should be expecting the profession to do that, rather than it becoming a fight. Sometimes, though, it takes time to achieve that synchronicity between what the child's needs are and what else. So the vast majority of children absolutely are part of our community. We don't ask them to live in separate houses. We don't ask them to go and live in different businesses. We don't ask them to go and live in other parts of the world. So our community needs to help everybody in an educational purpose is we all learn how all of our differences can be accommodated. There's a really tiny number of children where the differences are so vast, so difficult to accommodate, where they need very specialist provision, and there is very specialist provision for those children, whether it be on island or elsewhere. But thankfully, they're a very small number of families.
Thank you, Eric. It might be worth if we can fit that on the work plan at some point, just pushing around that, Cindy, I think, because there's obviously a lot of information that we need. Otherwise, we keep asking the same question over and over again. I think with your knowledge, it'd be fascinating as well as very informative. Any other questions? No, we're doing well. You pulled the time back well, you lot. I'm very impressed. So it's committee's work plan. Anybody got anything to kind of add to a future work plan? I know, Councillor Andre, you had something.
Yes, Chair, thank you. I'm sure members will be aware of a very detailed annual survey that's produced by the Youth Trust, and they're just about to publish the survey for this year, and I think it would be a really valuable tool to add to the work plan.
Okay, we'll ask Paul and Marie and Sarah, see where you can fit that in. Steve.
Councillor Andre, I'm just whispering about it. The government is publishing a green paper on SEND, picking up your asking, in the next month or so. And there'll be likely 14 weeks for a response. So it might be that we want to have a discussion on SEND, but it would fit most neatly within the June agenda. Yeah. That creates another problem in terms of how we reshape that. But it wouldn't make, I suppose you could do it after the green paper being consulted on by.
Be nice to feed
I would have thought so personally that they would feed into our response to the green paper.
Yeah, I mean, June does make sense. We can have a look at what, I mean, performance and budget we can't really do a lot about, can we? School governor recruitment, I'm conscious we've bumped that twice, and I think that is becoming quite a big problem with school governor recruitment, and I think we need to, as a committee, do something to help on the island. So yeah, we'll have to think on Councillor Andre.
Sorry, Chair, if I may, the intention was, thank you, the intention was with the school governor paper that off the back of that, we launch a recruitment drive to have some more complete governing bodies in September. So it would be preferable not to delay that any further. Thank you.
If I can make a suggestion, the youth spending item is important but not time critical. So that would appear to be one that could be bumped down to September. And then that would leave a bit of space on the June agenda.
Impressive work, well done. So that just leaves members' questions time. And none of you got any questions, have you? Councillor Christensen.
Sorry, I've been speaking to people recently about the importance of the first 2 years of life and the early years provision, and I think obviously things we've been talking about, it leads on from there, and that first 1001 days is really critical for their development, and I think that interaction that they get at that stage, and there's concerns of the provision of for under twos, and including baby groups, children's centres, health visitors. And I'm just wondering what we can do about that, really, what your thoughts are on, I don't know, how this fits into this level we're here, really. So, thank you.
So there's a number of things in this. The first thing you can take some assurance from is our level of attainment for children in the early years. It's actually we're at national averages. So, and when you sort of look at that vis-a-vis basic deprivation, etc., that's probably pretty good for the island. So that means that children are learning and getting their developmental milestones. So that's one point. Second point is about the range of early support that we have for families, and actually our early help services through Bernardo's, but we commission and sort of frame, is pretty impressive and has been looked at by the government. You'll have heard the stuff around family hubs, no doubt, which is Andrea Ledson's sort of initiative. but which is currently, whenever I speak to somebody at the DfE, the answer is family hubs, which is a bit worrying because they've only got enough money for 75 areas, and I suspect we won't be one of them. But the reality is we've been doing family hubs on the island for quite a while, and they came and looked at us, and we've ended up seconding one of our workers into the national programme about family hubs to develop Ireland. So I think that shows quite impressive, and that there is a range of support for families. So that's my answer, if you like. But I'm not averse. I've got an eye on the forward programme, but I'm not averse to a broader discussion, and we can sort of set out what the range of stuff that we do for families, not just what we do, also there's a range of, it's one of those things where it's not just the state that does this, it's a whole range of private childminders, private nurseries, and there is a sufficiency, there is enough on the island just at the moment, and they're regulated by Ofsted, etc. But we're very happy to bring a more substantive discussion back. But I do think there's a level of assurance that you can take around the earlier provision, looking at the outcomes that those children are achieving.
And just as that, if I'm a councillor in the south of the island and we feel like it's Bentner area and the South White that doesn't have as much provision as perhaps the rest of the island, so it's been highlighted to me. So I think perhaps if we could look into that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're starting to fill in March 2023 now, so well done. Yeah, Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. I've got a question for Councillor Andre, please. So it's now almost a month since the deferral of the decision on the future of Chillerton and Rookley Primary School, and it's vitally important that families and staff have an understanding of what is planned and when as soon as possible. As you are also aware, there are rising numbers of surplus places across the primary sector on the island, and the Chillerton and Rookley decision will impact all primary schools, making the need for a decision even more urgent. Could you please give an update as to what action has been taken since the decision to defer?
Thank you for your question, Councillor Ellis. Yes, I'm only too well aware of the situation. At this current point in time, what I can tell you is there has been progress. It wouldn't be appropriate at this stage to actually go into the specifics, but I'm sure you'll agree that it's important that we do due diligence to actually get all of the evidence that we need to ensure that we do make the right recommendation. And the reason, as you're well aware, that I deferred was because there was information that I felt had not been fully researched. And that's what we're doing now. So as soon as I'm in a position to give a timeline, I will. But the important thing is that we fully research that information. Thank you.
I do think at some point in the future it is probably worth looking at how this decision came about and what happened to what it's in the future. Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Councillor Andre, for your answer. I would just like to add that it's not a particular question, it's more of a concern and a comment that I understand due diligence, I understand your information, but you did have 9 months in which to look for that, so thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Councillor Elroy.
Thank you, Chair. I've also a question for you, Councillor Andre, and it's on the same topic, or pretty much. It's in the ballpark, let's put it that way. The primary school admission intake numbers coming up. I know there's some real concern about the numbers for this coming September. I believe we're looking at a 22% shortfall compared to the, so we've got a surplus of 310 places in primary schools. We've got 40 primary schools, only 11 of them are going to have a full intake coming this September. I know that head teachers have expressed concerns about the educational and financial sustainability that is going to cause some of them. I know one school that's very near to me, where I live, has got very low numbers and a significant shortfall coming financially this September. So, and that obviously plays into the time, the dragging of the time it's taken to make a decision over the Chillerton School. Can you tell me what the strategy is, or tell this committee what the strategy is going forward for addressing this significant surplus of school places in primaries, and whether there are going to be any decisions in the near or short, medium term to close some of the primary schools on the Isle of Wight?
Thank you for your question, Councillor Outlaw, and I'm glad that you've actually hit on the fact that it's not just about one school, and it's about getting our place planning strategy right for the island. And that's what we are looking into, that's what we are researching. I'm very well aware that there will be impacts of any decision on other primary schools because we have a finite number of children. But that's why we can't just look at Chillerton and Rookley in isolation, and I can assure you that it is part of a primary place planning strategy for the island.
Supplementary? Yes, so there is a plan in place. Obviously, we'd like to have an idea of what that plan looks like. And clearly, we can see from some of the difficulties that you've had in terms of making a decision on the Chillerton issue that there are significant political and area considerations. A lot of, if we were to turn around and say, let's close St Helens School, and I think that's been discussed many years ago, the decision is a very difficult one, and I accept that there are difficult decisions around that, but they do need to be made. So what I would like is, if possible, would it be, I know we were discussing the committee's work plan, but in reality, this is a really serious issue. Could we potentially have a report coming to the June committee into where that strategy is going?
Sorry, I don't want to interject too much, but members might recall we did have Martin presented on this topic. Martin Goff presented on this topic in September. It was on screen because we were in a bit of lockdown at that stage, I think. So we did have the overview of that. What then needs to happen, and is happening. We were awaiting some further NHS data, which I think landed last week, actually. And then we've got to then do really detailed balancing work and bring that back. I have no problem with bringing back the strategy. That's fine. I just don't think we won't be there for June. That's the caveat I have to give. But you can be sure that we are working on that. But it is quite detailed planning that we have to do. We think, well, no, I won't go into that. In the short term, that there's work to do around hands for school. Then we've got the longer term implications to work through.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And presumably part of that plan strategy and all the hard work that you are doing, I understand that you need time to sort of bring that back to us. Does that involve discussions with governors, head teachers?
We will do, but
it
we're
will, but not yet.
Yet.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Councillor Christensen.
Yeah, sorry, could I ask to sort of supplementary to that as well, that are you using this opportunity to look at a different way to actually use these schools for the advantage of the Isle of Wight children?
Absolutely, and thank you for that, and I'd like to reassure you that it's our island children that are very much at the centre of this. So we have a real opportunity here, I think, which is the reason for deferring, is that there is an opportunity to actually take a fresh look, if you like, at strategic place planning. It's not an exact science, but as Steve said, we have to drill down into the data and make sure that we actually get this place planning right. So yes.
The other complication on it is that not all the place planning is within our gift. So we now have a mixed economy of schools. So we have academy schools, we have a free school, we have a maintained schools. So the other thing, just to throw into this mix, I don't propose delaying what we're doing for it, but just to make you aware, the other thing that's going to happen in the next 3 months is there will be a white paper on school organisation. And that, I've been involved in that, I know what's in it. That will have a very significant impact on some of this, in a positive way, I think. But that doesn't, we cannot, it's a white paper, it's not law. There will then be, so we can't wait for that. We'll have to do whatever we have to do in regards to our current place planning strategy. But in the longer term, I'm more optimistic that we'll have more levers that will actually help us to make a rational plan around what we do.
And just to follow up on Councillor Outlaw, so I think hopefully you've had the reasons why we can't come back to you in the short term, but certainly we will come back as soon as we have done that due diligence. It won't be the short term, but it won't be, it's something that we will be working methodically through to come to a conclusion on that.
Thank you. Just to say on that, it's going to be hard for all of us because it's going to affect all of our wards. Now, I just need to remind us all that our place on this committee means we do the best for the island and not just our wards. Save the ward stuff for full council, save it for the theatre, and I'll let Jeff deal with you all. But that's going to be our difficulty, is that we are going to have to work as a committee to get the best, and it's going to be uncomfortable because just 310 children short. So unless we can stop lots of people loving the island as a retirement village and want to come over here and procreate, we've got a bit of a problem for a while. So that's I'd like to say to close that. Any further questions or comments? Okay. Oh, not again for that. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, just thinking on that, we've got all these home educated children and these spare places. What are we actually doing to try and help those children transition into these places that we've got?
It's not. We did have a look at that. The numbers don't really stack up. And if you look at the primary year group, it's about 25 kids. It's not. And equally, there's also parental choice in that. It doesn't quite. It doesn't get us to where we would need to get to. Be honest. Yeah.
No, fair enough. Anything else for anybody? I must admit, Rod is much quieter than you. So, thank you all. Thank you all for time. Thank you those who coming across the water as usual. It's much appreciated. Thank you, Rachel, for attending. You're very welcome to come again. Just enjoy the rest of your weekend or wherever you're at. It's Thursday. Yes, enjoy your weekend. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chair.